By the end of the 1970s, Soviet leaders firmly believed that the Soviet Union was gaining the upper hand in the Cold War. Their main rival, the United States, had suffered a major blow in Vietnam and was grappling with deep internal unrest. The Soviets believed that the capitalist West was entering a period of stagnation, while the Soviet Union was successfully exporting the revolution to countries like Angola and Ethiopia and rapidly expanding its military arsenal. In terms of international diplomacy, the Soviet Union was also thriving. On October 23, 1974, the International Olympic Committee awarded Moscow the right to host the 1980 Olympic Games, a remarkable diplomatic and cultural triumph as it marked the first time in history that a communist nation would host the Olympic Games. To add insult to injury, Moscow received twice as many votes as Los Angeles, a city that had been actively campaigning to host the Olympic Games since 1948. This decision of the International Olympic Committee has been extensively debated. Some scholars argue that the Soviet Union had threatened to withdraw from the International Olympic Committee if its bid failed, while others suggest that awarding the Games to Moscow was a strategic move intended by the International Olympic Committee to ease Cold War tensions and support a policy of peace and cooperation. Other sources indicate that the decision resulted from an extensive and highly coordinated campaign by the Soviet Union. Starting in the 1960s, Soviet officials organized international events, dispatched sports ambassadors, and provided aid, particularly targeting non-aligned nations in South America, Asia, and Africa. The Soviets played by the rules of the game, carefully navigating the internal culture of the International Olympic Committee, which at the time was seen less as a formal global institution like the United Nations and more as an elite gentlemen's club driven by money, favors, and personal diplomacy. Over time, the Soviets learned how to position themselves within this system to win the vote for the 1980 Olympics. By the late 1970s, Soviet authorities implemented sweeping measures to ensure the 1980 Olympic Games would serve as a flawless showcase of socialist achievement. In the aftermath of the 1972 Olympic Munich massacre, when a Palestinian terrorist group killed 11 Israeli athletes due to poor planning and miscommunication by German authorities, security became a top priority for future Olympic Games. Tensions also escalated in January 1977 when a bomb exploded in the Moscow metro, deepening Soviet concerns over the threat of domestic terrorism. In this context, the 1980 Moscow Olympics came to be seen not merely as a global sporting event, but as a crucial opportunity for propaganda and diplomacy. Despite initial uncertainty among Soviet leadership, it was ultimately decided that security would be entrusted to the infamous KGB and MVD. By the late 1970s, the KGB had become convinced that the Games would be targeted as a means to hurt the Soviet Union and global communism. Intelligence agencies were particularly concerned about the possibility of a Western-backed attack, whether by Ukrainian or Baltic nationalist groups, or by Western activists acting as tourists aiming to disrupt the Games and damage the Soviet Union's international image. In response, the Soviet government launched an extensive security plan, which included increased police funding, the creation of specialized counter-terrorist units, and heightened surveillance, particularly within the Moscow Olympic Village. These measures were intended to prevent any incidents resembling Munich and to ensure that the Games projected an image of Soviet strength, control, and unity to the world. Ultimately, it was the Soviet Union itself that endangered both the security and international success of the Games. In December 1979, just months before the much-anticipated 1980 Moscow Olympics, Soviet forces invaded their southern neighbor, Afghanistan, an action the Soviet leadership framed as necessary to stabilize a collapsing communist regime and maintain strategic influence in the region. The decision quickly backfired as the invasion was widely condemned by the international community, and soon came to be known as the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a reference to the prolonged, bloody, and costly nature of the conflict. This turn of events dramatically transformed the 1980 Moscow Olympics from a celebration of international sport into an unexpected battleground of the Cold War, as, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a politically weakened President Jimmy Carter launched a last-ditch effort to counter Soviet ambition by calling a US-led boycott of the Games. By April 1980, President Jimmy Carter and the CIA decided that to punish the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the United States and its allies should mount a unified boycott of the Moscow Olympics. By targeting the Soviet Union's ability to display its international prestige, Carter's administration hoped the boycott would humiliate the Soviets and deliver a serious blow to both its domestic legitimacy and global reputation. Allowing the Soviet Union to attack another nation while continuing business as usual with the international community like the Olympics was both unacceptable and dangerous. The upcoming Olympic Games threatened to normalize Soviet aggression on the world stage, and from Carter's perspective, a boycott was the only viable option to raise international awareness and demonstrate a strong, cohesive opposition. The United States was taking a strong stance against the Games, invoking the ancient Greek Olympic principle: no nation may serve as the Olympic host while invading and subjugating another. Though framed as a courageous moral stand, the boycott carried a note of hypocrisy. Ironically, while American troops were actively engaged in Vietnam, the US submitted for the Olympics Detroit in 1966, Los Angeles in 1970, and Los Angeles again in 1974. This inconsistency persisted decades later, when the 2002 Salt Lake City Winter Olympics were held during the American War in Afghanistan. Despite the political risk, President Carter continued his crusade by sending former Olympic gold medalist and world heavyweight boxing champion Muhammad Ali on a diplomatic tour of several African nations, hoping to convince them to join the US-led boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. However, what Ali was expecting to be a warm and welcoming visit, given his popularity in Africa, quickly turned into a diplomatic failure. Lacking a simple understanding of African and world politics, Ali struggled to answer basic questions. While he did communicate a general message about defending human rights and condemning the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Ali was criticized for his hypocrisy. For example, many pointed out how the United States had refused to support the 1976 boycott of the Montreal Olympics, which had been led by African nations protesting New Zealand and apartheid South Africa. Rather than convincing nations to support the boycott, Muhammad Ali was humiliated, and the boycott didn't gain any new supporters.
And completely cutting off any kind of connections with South Africa and such racist regimes. Now, finally, I say again that we have received this message and we shall consider it, and we shall see how the issue develops.
Despite Ali's diplomatic failures, the boycott continued. On March 21, 1980, Jimmy Carter addressed approximately 100 current and former Olympic athletes and coaches in the East Room of the White House. Carter made it clear:
the American people are convinced that we should not go to the Summer Olympics. The Congress has voted overwhelmingly, almost unanimously, which is a very rare thing, that we will not go. And I can tell you that many of our major allies, particularly those democratic countries who believe in freedom, will not go.
Those who believe that sport has nothing to do with politics are living in a dream world.
The Soviet press was quick to ridicule Carter's boycott, framing it as an aggressive and politically motivated assault not only on the Soviet people who had worked so hard on it, but on the whole international sport community. Media outlets specifically targeted the US government, which they accused of hypocrisy, claiming to uphold democratic values while denying its own athletes the freedom to compete. By boycotting what was presented as a peaceful global celebration, the United States was, in the eyes of the Soviets, abandoning peace by disrupting international cooperation. The blame was no longer on the Soviet tanks in Kabul, but on Washington's refusal to respect international decorum and let athletes compete. For the Soviets, the Games were a defiant stand for friendship, understanding, and youth solidarity across borders. And the absence of American and Allied athletes was not a sign of Soviet isolation, but proof that the West had turned its back on these ideals. Those who did participate were celebrated as defenders of true Olympic spirit, willing to rise above politics to foster peace among nations. The United States of America suggested to the International Olympic Committee changing the location of the Games several times, but these were not taken seriously. Instead,
the International Olympic Committee are unanimous that the Games must be held in Moscow as planned.
The Olympic boycott was framed in Western media as a patriotic and courageous response to Soviet aggression and human rights violations. However, a notable critic was Alaskan Senator Ted Stevens, who delivered a speech arguing that American athletes who had trained for years and whose Olympic dream might only come once should be the ones to decide whether to go to the Games or stand with Carter. This position echoed that of British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who, despite publicly supporting the US boycott, ultimately allowed British athletes to decide for themselves whether to participate. Senator Stevens believed that by competing, American athletes could witness the Soviet system firsthand and serve as a living symbol of Western freedom, exposing the realities and failures of communism on the global stage. In the streets, a man from Washington suggested that
Carter should send the basketball team to the Olympics, launch a strategic missile straight into Moscow.
beyond the United States, the boycott received criticism due to its use as a political tool by leaders seeking an easy way to gain favor with the West. For example, dictator Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines quickly endorsed the boycott during a period of economic instability and growing international scrutiny over the regime's corruption and human rights abuses. Similarly, South Korea joined the boycott amid a widespread labor unrest, police brutality, student protest, and political violence, seeking to strengthen its alliance with the United States during a time of domestic turmoil. The Moscow Games managed to survive, but with severe economic consequences. Of the 1.7 million tickets reserved for foreign sale, only 1.3 million were sold, and nearly all Western sponsors withdrew the support, with Adidas standing alone in honoring its commitments. As for participation, of the 105 nations initially confirmed to attend, only 80 sent athletes to Moscow, the lowest turnout since 1956. Although around 60 nations boycotted the Games, which may seem like a clear win for the Carter administration, a closer examination of which countries participated, which did not go, and how they chose to engage reveals a more accurate picture of the 1980 Moscow Olympics and the broader geopolitical landscape of the time. So, as I mentioned, the 1980 Olympic boycott involved 60 nations, most of them aligned with the United States. But some key non-aligned countries also joined, as for example China, which boycotted due to the Sino-Soviet split. These non-aligned nations were especially significant, since they were often seen as the main battleground of the Cold War, with both the United States and the Soviet Union competing for their support. Now let's take a look at who attended the Games. Of course, all the Soviet-aligned communist nations attended, but surprisingly 16 US-aligned nations also attended the Games. Australia, Greece, and Iceland marched under their own national flags during the opening ceremony. Others, like New Zealand, used their own national Olympic banner, while some other countries like the UK decided to participate under a simple white Olympic banner. Still, the presence of these athletes in the Games marked a small symbolic win for Moscow. What I find more interesting, however, is the participation of athletes from many third world and non-aligned nations despite the boycott. The presence of these countries in Moscow was a major diplomatic win for the Soviet Union, as the majority of non-aligned nations chose to ignore the US boycott. This, in my opinion, was a huge win for the Games and the Soviet Union, as it presented an amazing opportunity for the Soviets to display their national strength and, of course, flood these nations with pro-communist propaganda. Now, while the Soviet Union was engaged in colonial-style intervention in Afghanistan, it still positioned itself during the 1980 Olympics as a champion of anti-colonial and anti-racist causes. Special recognition was given to the 7 nations making their Olympic debut, which the Soviet Olympic Committee celebrated as a contribution to the expanding Olympic family. For these emerging and decolonized nations such as Angola, Mozambique, Laos, Botswana, Cyprus, and Jordan, participation signified more than just athletic competition. By resisting the American boycott, these countries were prioritizing their national pride and independence over Cold War politics. This factor was not considered into President Carter's decision, as for many of these nations, debuting in the 1980 Olympics marked a symbolic entry into international events and global affairs. Also, when welcoming these new participants with open arms, the Soviet Union claimed a meaningful victory in the Cold War struggle for influence amongst the new nations of the late 20th century. Also not considered by President Carter were the American athletes themselves, as most of them only get 1 or 2 precious chances to demonstrate their dedication and training at the prestigious Olympics. Forcing athletes to sacrifice their lifelong dream for a political statement felt wrong and selfish. The boycott was a devastating blow to American athletes like Ronaldo Nehemiah and Edwin Moses, who were expected to shatter records and receive global recognition in the 1980 Olympics.
I was running very easy that year, so it was a good year for me. And in 1980, I did resign from my job as an engineer specifically to train for the 1980 Games. And I actually was in probably the best shape of my life.
As for countries that gave their athletes a choice, like Margaret Thatcher, it did put them in a tricky situation.
We're quite young, and we're having to deal with some pretty difficult situations that most politicians would find tricky.
And so, for the first time in the history of the Olympic Games, a British competitor receives a gold medal under the Olympic flag and to the music of the Olympic anthem.
In the end, the 1980 Moscow Games were both beautiful and controversial. The opening ceremony, for instance, drew heavily on ancient Greek aesthetics, emphasizing the Olympic ideals of peace and cooperation. At the same time, the Soviet Union aimed to present a clean image of a united and diverse Soviet bloc, welcoming the world with open arms, including their ideological rivals. This, of course, came with heavy criticism. As noted earlier, the KGB was everywhere during the Games, determined to orchestrate the show flawlessly while maintaining a positive image of Moscow. Of course, many skeptical Western journalists saw straight through this, highlighting the overwhelming security presence, with countless grim-faced Soviet soldiers lined up across the city. A reporter for the BBC noted that
the security was, just over the top in every conceivable way. Getting back in and out of the hotel, back in the hotel in the evening, you had to go through the same process. Everything was searched, you were searched, frisked.
These security concerns were not only reserved for journalists. A British athlete claimed that a man called Boris would walk every day into his room at 4 to make sure that the television was still working. An American journalist described something more sinister in Moscow, more unsettling than the sight of Soviet soldiers or hidden security cameras. What he was feeling was a haunting presence, a face that seemed to follow him wherever he went, with a demented, loopy gaze, which he described as someone drunk on vodka trying to forget the decline of the Soviet Union. This demented creature was no other than the adorable and recognizable cuddly bear that came to symbolize the entire event, Misha the bear. Widely promoted by Soviet media and an instant hit, Misha is often the first thing people remember about those games. Some Soviet citizens would come to remember Misha with a sense of nostalgia, viewing the bear as a symbol of their childhood and a simpler time. For any American viewers, this was sort of like a communist version of the Yogi Bear, but of course, this bear was owned by the state. The creator of Misha, Russian artist Viktor Chichikov, came up with the idea due to his dislike for how the Russian bear was typically portrayed in political cartoons as vulgar and rude. So, determined to offer an alternative, he created an optimistic character that evoked the best of human emotions. Through Misha, he sought not only to soften the image of the Soviet bear, but also to improve the Soviet Union's image on the global stage. Misha was everywhere throughout the Games, even coming to life in some competitions.
The living mascot of the Olympic Games, Misha, performed in the circus. You can be sure he did a lot of training and strictly abided by the rules in order to win the right to appear at such a grand sports holiday.
While Misha was a marketing and propaganda triumph for the Soviets, many critics saw through the irony and used it to mock the regime. Despite the mascot's global popularity, Chichikov received no royalties as he was paid a mere 2,000 rubles for his creation. To add insult to injury, while Misha was intended to embody the Soviet ideals of communism and peace, he ultimately became a capitalist money-making machine, with his shy face printed and sold on t-shirts, toys, notebooks, and anything promoters could find. As for the ongoing war, a cuddly bear was not enough to overshadow Soviet aggression in Afghanistan. American media highlighted the hypocrisy of Misha's charm, contrasting his innocent appearance with the Russian grizzly that was swiping its claws of steel across Kabul. This criticism extended beyond the West, as in Afghanistan the cuddly bear was depicted being stabbed, calling for a boycott of the Moscow Olympic Games over the Soviet invasion. Yet, with the power of Misha and the energetic crowds attending every sporting event, Soviet athletes did not disappoint their nation. The absence of many Western athletes allowed the Soviet Union to, in their own words, harvest a considerable number of Olympic achievements, ultimately winning 80 gold, 69 silver, and 46 bronze medals. These victories were used by Soviet authorities to promote the superiority of their physical culture and, in the grand scale of things, to project an image of Soviet strength and ideological dominance to the rest of the world. The Games also featured extraordinary athletic performances. 36 world records and 74 Olympic records were broken, alongside hundreds of continental and national bests. Soviet commentators interpreted these results as evidence of the overall advancement of global sport, particularly significant with the Soviet Union on top and serving as the stage of these historical feats. Western journalists, however, criticized the Games, arguing that the boycott and its missing participants, like Edwin Moses, had undermined the competition and stripped many of the medals of their real significance. Soviet athletes were also accused of state-sponsored cheating, the use of steroids, and bribing of judges.
It wasn't a surprise to say that East Germany and Russia and basically, all the Eastern Bloc countries had won so many medals. And it wasn't a surprise whatsoever that years later, all this evidence came out. And in fact, the lady that beat me, Katja Schneider, admitted to taking little blue pills.
What most journalists, athletes, and visitors could not ignore was that the Moscow Olympics were undeniably unique, emotionally charged, and dynamic. Despite the absence of the United States and its allies, there remained a strong atmosphere of camaraderie and unity to the whole event. The athletic performances were undoubtedly outstanding, even if they were done with steroids. Yet the highlight of the Games was the unforgettable and dramatic closing ceremony. On August 3rd, in the Grand Arena of the Central Lenin Stadium, the Olympic torch, burning since the opening, was finally extinguished while athletes were honored by an energetic and emotional crowd. Fireworks and beautiful mosaics covered the whole stadium as a massive balloon of Misha circled the stadium to the sound of dramatic music.